So one of the things I love the most about our community is how caring and welcoming we are, as I'm sure you have all seen in your time here. I think that something that really struck me when I was thinking about that is that us programmers are often stereotyped as being really out of touch. And I'm really proud of how in the Ruby community, we've really come to value and embody that welcoming spirit, that inclusivity. But I have some bad news. As an industry, the products we build are incredibly unwelcoming to people with disabilities. Depending on who you ask, between 70 and basically all of the % of the internet is effectively out of reach for people who are blind. But I have some good news. We can do better, and I'm here to show you how. So we've been working really hard over the past couple of years to make GitHub more usable for people with disabilities. And I'd love to share what we've learned so you can do the same at your company. But I might as well do a quick intro. My name is Joel. I'm a staff engineer at GitHub. I would kind of describe my role as being one half of our UI architects. So we have someone who's a little bit more React focused, and I'm the more traditional Rails focused person. I work on all sorts of UI related things as they affect the company, such as accessibility. And I live like a 10-minute drive from here. So Spike, thank you for throwing a conference that was super close. I can tuck my 1-year-old boy into bed tonight, thanks to you, and I don't have to, FaceTime him instead. So as a quick recap, I actually gave a talk last year about accessibility tooling. I shared how we use Axe, which is an automated accessibility scanner, to automatically surface accessibility issues in our app. We happen to highlight them in red if you're a staff member. But I talked about how it can only catch so much. It's just automation. It's not complete. I shared how we use some custom abstractions, like in this case, a form builder, to define certain classes of accessibility errors out of existence. And then I also showed Lookbook, something I was just telling you about a couple minutes ago. It's a tool like Storybook that we use to build our UI pieces in isolation. And that allows us to more thoroughly test them for accessibility issues. And for those of you who are here, I hope you remember it as being a good talk. I think it was well received. But what really struck me is the questions afterward had nothing to do with the talk. And to me, that was a sign that I gave a talk on the wrong topic. So today's talk is answering those questions in more detail. And the questions I got really amounted to questions we're all used to getting as Rails developers, which is, that's nice, but how do you scale it? It's a question I'm definitely used to, especially at GitHub, where I feel like we're constantly being used as an example of how Rails does and doesn't scale, quite honestly. But to be more specific, there were kind of 3 questions. One was, how do you get leadership to care? How do you make your entire application accessible? These tools are cool, but how do you scale it up to like something big? And then how do you keep it that way? Like say we go and invest all this money, how do we make sure we don't regress? But before I get too far, how many of you here have accessibility goals of any kind at your company? Okay, not bad. How many of you here have worked on them personally? About the same hands. Cool. We've long worked to make GitHub accessible. We've had various teams across the years make improvements of what I would call like fits and starts, but there was never really a widely coordinated effort. We never really had any specific goals that were like, we want to get to this standard in this time. That all changed when we got bought. As it turns out, Microsoft cares deeply about accessibility, not just because it's the right thing, but because it's often a non-negotiable requirement of the big government and enterprise sales contracts that Microsoft is famous for. There are, of course, many non-technical and non-economic reasons to make our products accessible. I think that we could all generally agree that it's the right thing to do. But I don't think I need to convince any of you of that. So I'm going to focus on the pragmatic, if not capitalistic reasons you should do accessibility and why you should take those reasons to your company. So a big one is that accessibility is a legal risk. While I'm not a lawyer, most of my work has actually come out of and been funded by our legal department. And I wouldn't be, giving you a talk about accessibility without mentioning that not having an accessible application is a very real legal risk and often a significant one. Many companies have faced legal pressure for accessibility issues, and GitHub is one of them. And part of my work I'm doing is actually in response to legal pressure we've received. And this is not anything new. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the greater accessibility field, but lawsuits have long been what some would argue the only effective tool for making buildings accessible for people with disabilities. There's a New York Times article aptly titled "The Man Who Filed More than 180 Disability Lawsuits," talking about how, for decades wheelchair users have had to sue businesses that don't have like a ramp or a table they can use so that they can go dine. The same is true for digital accessibility. According to Forbes, who does not know the definition of exponential, there were over twice as many digital accessibility lawsuits filed in 2023 as in 2018. As a former journalist, it just kills me. But I showed this slide to my colleague earlier this year, and she's like, "Yeah, that's kind of impressive, but did you know that in the last 5 years, 80% of the top 500 e-commerce websites in the world have been sued over accessibility?" It's like most of them. So if you're in the 20%, this talk is for you. Well, maybe you're doing a great job and you didn't get sued because of it. So our most concrete goal for GitHub.com is really pretty simple. We want to make it so that when people use our UI with assistive technology, they are not blocked. They can accomplish any goal that a sighted user is able to accomplish. And in practice, that means complying with WCAG 2.1, soon to be 2.2. These are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's actually an international standard, and it's used by companies and governments in purchasing decisions. In fact, if you've seen the new European regulations, I think they took the WCAG numbers and like appended a suffix to them or something like that. It's like 2.11e for like the European version of it. It's pretty much equivalent around the globe. So whenever I share how we do things at GitHub, I think that it's really important to provide some context because we are a very big company, and I want you to like take some of the things I'm saying with a grain of salt. We have about 4,000 employees. We had like 600 when I joined, which is wild. We have about 1,500 engineers, and still, I will say this every year until it's not true, we are still a Ruby on Rails monolith. Despite what everyone thinks is changing, it's not meaningfully changing. Almost all of our API traffic and UI traffic comes directly through the monolith to this day. And that's like 10 billion requests per day, something like that. Probably more at this point. Maybe Nathan, do you know if it's over 10 billion yet? I have no idea. You have no idea? Okay.
But does it scale?
Does it scale? Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, I don't know, is 10 billion scale? Are we there yet? I don't know. We also have around 2,000 pages, which I think is more relevant to the accessibility work. Like we have 2,000 pages just in our monolith that we need to make accessible. And I think I've inventoried somewhere around 100,000 additional pages on like static marketing, documentation websites, et cetera. So massive footprint. Many of you have been also asking me, 95% of those routes still are just rendered in ERB, maybe with Vue component. 5% of those routes are rendered with React. No comment. So what I'm curious here, how many people here work by themselves? How many people here work with at least 5 people? How about 10? 50? Okay, I'm very alone here. Okay, how about like 100? 500? 1,000? Okay, yeah, so it's basically me and the Cisco guys. Okay. Regardless of the size, I think the kind of like the fundamental concepts of what I'm going to talk about today, do apply across scale. But know that there's a lot of process that I'll talk about that maybe you need a smaller version of it than we do. So I think there are kind of like 3 key things we've learned after doing this for a couple of years that like actually have impact when it comes to investing in accessibility. And the first one is measurement. You got to have a target, right? You can't just go out and do it without a target. Second thing is having durable ownership, making sure that like everyone can agree whose responsibility it is. And then the last one was lived experience. Like you got to make sure that it actually works for people with disabilities, not just that it meets the WCAG. So a few years into my time at GitHub, I joined the design organization as an engineer, and I reported to basically our head of design for the company. And I remember an early conversation with her about how I was really frustrated about how there's technical debt everywhere, and no one uses our design system, our UI is super inconsistent. And what she said to me is, there will always be something wrong. Like, code is never finished. Like, why should we care in this specific context? How will we know that we've succeeded when it comes to UI consistency? And honestly, just figuring out the scale of the accessibility work we've had to do was a challenge in and of itself before even addressing it. And one of my a book on this topic is called How to Measure Anything, and it's really, really dry. But it basically just talks about how, like, when you're coming up with a measurement, you really need that measurement to be able to accurately boil down to a Boolean value. So, like, basically to tell you whether you met your goal or not, and really you don't need more precision than that. So, we're all very well aware of this kind of measurement. Tests are like this. They let us quickly learn if something is good or bad, right? So if you think about it, like, if premature optimization is the root of all evil, in the case of doing this kind of work, maybe making a change without a target is also a root of evil. So we need to come up with a way to measure our accessibility problem. And I'll go through how we did that, at least for our marketing pages. So I started with our DNS configuration. In our case, we have somehow rigged it up through source control. So you make all DNS changes through YAML files. And this gave me a list of about the 100 domains that we have publicly accessible pages on. And with that, I wrote a script that pulled up in Chrome and ran that Axe tool I talked about last year and reported the statistics to Datadog. And what this basically showed is that each color in this graph is one of our websites. And what this meant is that we had 18 accessibility violations just on the homepage of our roughly 100 properties. And this is actually pretty good. The industry average is 55 detected by Axe on a page that's been unremediated. But these are the things that are pretty, Axe is very conservative in what it reports. It only reports things that are very confidently wrong. These aren't warnings, these are errors. And I'll also just say that if someone comes to your site and can find something that Axe can find, it's basically evidence that you didn't even try, because it's super obvious stuff. And these things, all these errors, all 1,800 of them, represent potential roadblocks for our customers. If they're using assistive technologies, those are all places where they might struggle to accomplish the goal that, say, a sighted user would want to accomplish. So we use the same tooling to scan our design system, and you can see we had a little bit of a rocky ride for our bug bash month, but we eventually got it down to 0. So this was a way that we tracked a month-long accessibility bug bash. We also use it in our system tests. So we have, I think it's a dozen critical paths that simulate, say, the process of opening a pull request or filing an issue or using GitHub projects. And this is the Axe report collated for all of those critical paths together over a 3.5 month time period. So this shows our ongoing progress, reducing the total number of accessibility violations encountered by our customers across critical flows. We also track longer term trends for some of our more critical rules. I don't know if you guys use Datadog, but at least for us, it's capped at 15 months. So if you want to show something that's longer than that, you need a different tool. So in this case, we literally just dump stuff into Google Sheets. And this is an example of our accessibility lint rules. So these are the number of violations per rule, just for a couple that we can detect statically with, I think it's using ERB lint. And you can see over time, going right until about 2022, things were on the rise. And that's when we started saying, okay, we need to make an effort about this. And then really, over the course of 2 years, we got a lot of these things significantly reduced. So while being Axe clean and reducing those violations doesn't mean that a page is accessible, it's often a very significant improvement over a page with Axe errors. And those graphs, literally those graphs, are what we brought to leadership that gave us more funding to hire contractors, to literally fill more engineering roles. That's what it took to go and say, okay, we need, $2 million more a year for our engineering budget. To answer your questions from last year. So to sum it up, you can't improve what you can't measure. And even a measurement that is a proxy for accessibility, like Axe scanning, can be really useful to demonstrate your progress. We were obviously making other changes besides just making our pages Axe clean. So I'd encourage you to go out and measure your Axe violations and then set some time aside to resolve them and continue to track them over time. So now you have that measurement. And you've made your app Axe clean, so you've made some improvements. How do you keep it that way? This question reminds me of a favorite thought experiment. Does anyone know what this ship represents?
Ship of Theseus.
Okay. Tell me more. What's the ship of Theseus?
So basically, I won't give like the mythological background on it.
Thank you.
So there's this ship, and it keeps taking damage, and they're replacing pieces of it. And the ship is always one ship, but after a certain point, every piece of the ship has been replaced, and none of the original ship is still there. And so the sort of thought experiment is it the same ship? And if not, when did it stop being the same ship? If you're replacing these items.
Well, you did a better job than I would have. Basically, the idea, to summarize, like I don't know if you could hear that on the recording, is that it's like if you were to replace every piece of an object over time, is it still the same object at the end of the day? In fact, there's a Git project called Git of Theseus that is really fun to run that will show you. It took 5 days to run on the 2 million commits in our code base, but it will show you the half-life, like the survival rate of all your code, which is really cool. But that all being said, this really reminds me of what legacy software looks like in practice. You know, code gets moved around, teams get reassigned constantly. Projects are put in maintenance mode. You know, people go on paternity leave or they move on to other jobs. So given all those factors, how do we make sure that if we like truly care about something that it doesn't fall through the cracks? And what we use is a tool called a service catalog. And those of you who have done security compliance work, specifically SOC 2, might be aware of this. So we built this originally to track our availability, believe it or not, to just say that, like, okay, for all the many areas of our product, who's actually responsible for making sure that thing is up or not? Then when security became a thing, we also used this as well. And basically what it means is that, like, for every chunk of our routes file, effectively, we group it together and we have a SLO, hopefully 4 nines, hopefully, an on-call rotation, and a chain of command up to a VP. And we enforce that in code. So we use code owners. We basically assign these GitHub teams to specific folders or files. And we'll also use programmatic tags. So this is a simplified version, but you might imagine that, like, you have a controller that actually, for better or for worse, is split between 2 services. We can use this macro to say map to service repos for specific actions, for example. What this means is that every line of code has an owning service, not an individual. It's something that I wish we didn't do in code owners on GitHub, where, like, you could assign a person. Like, I think that's pretty unhealthy for a lot of companies to be like, okay, this is Dan's code, right? Like, that's not good for you, Dan, and it's not good for everyone else. Enforcing every line of code to be owned by a service instead of a person really revealed a lot of bust factors. In fact, as part of going on leave, it's often an audit to go look at all of the stuff that you have ownership for and make sure you are on a team of 1. Which is what actually happened to me, and it inspired us to hire some people that split my ownership away from me, which is pretty cool. We also require playbooks for each service. So, like, in order to get in this catalog, you have to have a playbook. So it's a way of us guarantee that we have some level of process, and documentation and whatnot. I would say that, like, as we've scaled beyond accessibility, this is the single most important competence we've added as an engineering organization. Like, it's been a night and day. Like, this is what I call, like, the adults walking into the room being like, okay, everyone has to be responsible. Like, yeah. So when I joined GitHub, there was 1 on-call rotation for the whole company when we were 600 engineers. So once every 90 days, I was the one person holding the L1 pager. It's not that way anymore, and this is why. Amongst other things, this allows us to do really cool stuff. Like, when you have an exception, we can programmatically assign it right away. So, like, for example, we have an exception in our search middleware, and it goes immediately to the team that owns that middleware without any, like, sort of triage. So, like, when we went from, like, 1 on-call to, like, service-specific on-call, we didn't want to have one person triage request to the right on-call. So this allowed us to do it programmatically. So when we care about any engineering capability now, not just availability or security, we give it a scorecard, and then we incrementally add services to that scorecard. So we say, like, okay, you are in compliance with the availability discipline, the security discipline. And these scorecards include criteria for whether a service is passing or failing. It's a binary measurement. And if you're failing, that leadership chain, that same on-call chain, is alerted, and basically you have to stop work until you're in compliance in a lot of cases. So for example, we have an accessibility compliance scorecard, and this one is for automation. So for some of those automation things we talked about, this enforces that a service is using our linters and that there are no disables of the lint rules. So you get a check mark on this if you are passing acts, basically. We then track our scorecard participation over time, and this is another way of showing progress. So you can say that, like, okay, we happen to have 220 services at GitHub. And you can see this blue line is just over, a month. We had an increase of 15 or 20 services that got in compliance. So code, team, projects, people, they all come and go. We should use systems to prevent services from becoming unowned. And a service catalog is one example of how you could do it. I'm sure at smaller companies, something a little less formal might be fine. So at the end of the day, the goal of any accessibility work is to make a product usable for as many people as possible, including people with disabilities. It's not to pass a specific audit or be in compliance with WCAG. And while we can get pretty far with automation and tooling and the things I've talked about already, there really is no substitute for lived experience. As a starting point, we taught people who are sighted across the company how to use screen readers to test their work. We also set up a champions program, which is a pretty common model, where we basically took someone from each team and gave them more in-depth training. So like for all those 220 services, for about, I think 50 or 60 of them that were the most critical, we said, okay, you have to commit one engineer who's going to do 20 hours of accessibility training. That was more in-depth knowledge on screen readers in that case. And our goal is basically to have one of those people trained up on as many teams that build UI as possible, of which we have about, of those 220, it's probably ending up being about 150. So to measure the impact of champions, we actually track their work. So we say, okay, how many issues did these people that we trained close? So this was another graph that we put in front of leadership that said, hey, these people that we trained have closed, 450 issues. And for reference, we put the cost of closing an accessibility issue between $5,000 and $10,000. So that allows us to directly say dollars to dollar people, right? That's a really important thing to do. Just if they speak dollars, you have to speak dollars to them. And while we have several employees with lived disability experience, they are a very small minority. I could probably count them on both hands in terms of people that have lived experience that specifically applies to the screen reader technology we're working on. And because of that, we've had to seek outside help. So we hired a couple consultancies. We've hired Tetralogical and Prime Access Consulting. They are super expensive, but they are subject matter experts. So if you don't have the expertise, you can buy it. And it's often startling. I remember early on when we worked with Prime Access, they work with NASA, Smithsonian, all the big entities. And their consultant, who's blind, pulled open our homepage and brought us all to tears. He's like, I can't fucking use it. Sorry. He's like, he couldn't sign up for an account. He was dead in the water, just going to .com, right? It was awful. But they aren't cheap. Consultants aren't cheap. So a good starting point could be, say, have a screen reader hackathon where, your team learns how to use screen readers, or Passion Week or something where, you try and test as much of your app as you can as a sighted user using a screen reader. On the product side, we've had to do this process called accessibility conformance reports, which use a specific template called the VPAT, or Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. And this is from Section 508. And that's a lot of jargon for really something simple, which is that you have to document your accessibility issues for critical workflows in your product. And we publish ours publicly. And this is often something that larger companies have to do as part of this process. And here's what it looks like. It's on accessibility.github.com. You can go read all of our ACRs today. This, for example, shows that when you go to the GitHub homepage and click the skip to main content link, the screen reader does not announce the main landmark. That's one specific screen reader bug. And this kind of disclosure is required by large customers because they want to understand what risk they're taking on. So you don't have to be perfect at accessibility to be quote unquote compliant. What you really need to do is you need to be aware. You need to say, okay, these are the problems we know we have. And then the customer can decide, okay, those are a deal breaker for us. In the case of some of our customers, they literally take them to the people who work for them that have disabilities and say, are these things going to get in the way of you using GitHub? And if not, they'll buy the software. We create these reports by navigating through about a dozen critical workflows that roughly line up to the ones I talked about testing earlier, very critically. So we have automated testing for a lot of these very key workflows that we assess. And we have to do this every year. And in fact, for more critical paths, we have to do it about every 6 months. And we pay an outside firm to do this for us. So we also track what services need those audits using a scorecard and the service catalog. You can see the pattern at this point. It's like, okay, if it matters, if people need to be responsible and held accountable, we put it in the service catalog. So while I would guess that most of you probably don't need this level of compliance, I think the principle of this tool is very compelling, despite the jargoniness of it. Because this process forces us to identify the key experiences in our products and to see if they are usable for people with disabilities. And what we found is it's easy to make the case to non-technical stakeholders that people with disabilities should be able to give us money. Because the last thing we want is for someone to be able to tell us that they can't do business with us because of their disability. And in fact, if you look at like the kind of the canon of accessibility lawsuits, they all basically hinge on being able to spend money or not. That's why e-commerce is like super prevalent, because it's very clear, like, oh, I couldn't buy the shirt, right? It's pretty easy to be like, could I, with a screen reader, go through and check out, right? And we have to make this case because, like, as I've said, this process requires a significant amount of money for a product of our scale. So for the low ballpark, we're spending, I would say, over $5 and under $10 million per year on all of our accessibility work as a company. That includes a 7-person accessibility engineering team that's full-time, a 3-person accessibility design team. Each of those teams have a manager. And I recognize this is a big hill to climb. Like, I'm not expecting, really, I would say that we're probably investing more than most companies do. But there is something you all can do today. And I have some homework for you. I have 3 tickets you can go file and get. You can even do it right now. Some of you are on your laptops. So here's the first one. As a screen reader user, I can sign up for a paid account. I can sign up for an account. And then as a screen reader user, I can upgrade to a paid account. So for example, for us, we still use a third-party payment provider, and like they control that UI code. So like you could sign up for an account, but when you went into the iframe to actually enter your credit card details, we had to work with them to actually get to the point where you could complete the flow as a customer. Your customer doesn't know that implementation detail. They just know whether they could actually sign up. And then the last one is, as a screen reader user, I can complete the workflow for my product's most compelling use case. So think about the founder of your company. When they went into an elevator and said, this is what my pitch is, that's what you should be writing a screen reader test for. Because if you can't deliver that core value, that's where you're going to get into trouble really quickly. So for us, this is like, can I open a PR? Can I complete a code review? Can I, run tests with actions and see the result? Can I merge a PR? And here's one way of doing it. You can use TDD. So one technique we've kind of adopted here is using system tests for keyboard navigation. Because at the end of the day, when you're using assistive technology, you're basically navigating the page with a keyboard. So what we did is we started by taking existing system tests that clicked on UI elements, and we rewrote them to use keyboard navigation. So for example, here's an actual test. This is the first test we converted from clicking to keyboard nav. And you don't need to read the source. I don't know why I put it on here. But you go to the new releases page, you select a tag that you pushed up, and you click on create release, and you press the enter button in this case. So what's wild here is that this is the first time we did this, and we caught a screen reader bug on day 1. Because this is what it looks like when you run that test. So as it turns out, there was some JavaScript that only triggered this lazily loaded portion of the dropdown, loading the tags list, if you had a cursor present on the window. This was super hard to debug because the test kept failing, and we would mouse into the page and it would just load. And we're like, great, it works. But then what we realized is that if you let it sit for a while, that was the bug. It was that when there was no cursor present, it never loaded. So this is literally the first time we tried this technique, and we validated that the page was indeed broken for screen reader users. We hit up actually our technological consultant, and they were like, oh yeah, it's never worked for me. And we're like, why didn't you tell us? So besides automated tests, like I said, you could, getting people to use your application without a mouse. Vim users are going to love to hear this, right? Like, some places they'll have no mouse Fridays. Just Friday, put your mouse away, tape over your trackpad. Oh, yeah. All these Vim users are like, finally, my day has come. I've waited all my life. Didn't know it was going to be for screen readers. But ultimately, for lived experience to matter, we need to employ people with disabilities, and then we need to give them power. So in our case, we hired a fantastic head of accessibility who has decades of experience in our legal department, who's also a computer science major, and is also blind, who uses a screen reader. And he is in control of the budget and can stop the line anywhere in the company if he thinks that we aren't doing things the right way for accessibility. And I believe that single move was the most important decision any leadership at our company has made since I've been at the company, was giving him power. Because it'd be disingenuous not to mention that this work is really hard. Like I said, it's expensive, it's also time consuming, and I can guarantee you that it will slow you down. But beyond being the right thing to do, our customers increasingly require it. Selling to the government and big business often means more of this compliance burden, and you can really see how it can limit innovation. But if we don't pursue this work, we run the very real risk of leaving those with disabilities behind, in this time of incredible technological progress. At GitHub, we believe that our software enables people to improve the world in a really powerful way, and we don't want to leave people with disabilities behind from that work. So here's my challenge for all of you. Measure your product's accessibility, own up to it, and then give people with lived experience the power to make it better. Thank you.
Time for a couple of questions.
Yeah, time for a couple of questions. I want to say thank you to my peers. These are some colleagues and Tim locally who are peer reviewers for this. Any more questions, or am I done giving talks here? It was Microsoft. So the question was getting that leadership change in a grassroots thing, and no, it was on high. In fact, honestly, it's because we weren't making enough progress on our own. They were like, okay, we're going to appoint this person in your legal department, and then this is their responsibility, and here's how much money they have and all this stuff. Sure. So the question was from someone who works at a university where accessibility compliance is probably actually the highest standard of most industries. How do you help individual developers learn how to use screen readers effectively and not run into blockers? I mean, I'll tell you what we do, which is we pay for training with DQ. There's a lot of good resources online, but DQ is where's it, DEC? I can't remember get it right. They make apps, and they have excellent resources that go through all this. That or hiring someone, honestly. That's a lot of what we've done, even with having the right experts in-house. We'll still do consultants and whatnot. Yeah. Anyone else? Great. Thank you all.